Programa de pós do Departamento de Educação. Programa de pós, né? Programa de pós-graduação de administração da
Jean, só outra coisa rapidinho. Você tem que passar dois slides?
Já está lá.
Já está lá. Tá.
Os
slides dele você
não,
já pegou?
não.
Vai pôr aqui nesse computador?
Não, vai lá.
É melhor já deixar lá, né?
Isso. Já está lá, não tem. Eu não recebi. Aí já está lá, só colocar lá. Ele tem internet. Faz 22, né?
22.
You're very sad.
vai piorando, né? Vai escalonando. Você acorda até bem e tal.
Mas é até melhor, né? Oi? O seu é onde? É que eu faço professores, né? Tem mais uma pessoa também. Uma pessoa.
Tá ok. Eu vou ter que entrar no evento aqui para endereçar.
Você manda uma mensagem.
Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Sejam muito bem-vindos. É com grande satisfação que o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Administração e o Instituto de Políticas Públicas e Desenvolvimento Sustentável, IPPDS, da Universidade Federal de Viçosa, os recebe para o primeiro Seminário Internacional sobre Políticas de Educação Superior e Mudanças Sociais. O evento busca discutir as relações entre o acesso à educação superior e a redução das desigualdades sociais no Brasil e no exterior, sobretudo a partir de políticas que buscam a inclusão nesse nível de ensino. No caso brasileiro, haverá ainda o debate sobre aspectos relacionados à política de cotas, como acesso, permanência e empregabilidade. Para compor a mesa de abertura, convidamos o representante do reitor da Universidade Federal de Viçosa e diretor do Centro de Ciências Humanas, Letras e Artes, professor Odemir Vieira Baeta. O diretor do Instituto de Políticas Públicas e Desenvolvimento Sustentável, IPPDS, professor Marcelo José Braga. O coordenador do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Administração, professor Wesley Xavier. Neste momento, passamos a palavra ao coordenador do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Administração, professor Wesley Xavier.
Bom dia a todos e todos. Né? É um prazer imenso, né, tê-los aqui. Né? Havia, de certo modo, uma insegurança nossa em relação à realização do evento, porque nós nos demos conta que coincidiria com o CIA, né? E isso, de certo modo, nos deixou um pouco temerário, mas ficamos felizes de conseguir realizar o evento e termos todos vocês aqui. Esse evento é bastante importante para a gente, principalmente porque ele trata de um tema que é muito importante, né, para nós, enquanto pessoas, enquanto pesquisadores, né, que acreditamos que a universidade ela pode transformar vidas. Né? Esse ano nós temos 10 anos da política de cotas e é visível como a universidade ela já se transformou. Né? Então, esse evento ele busca estabelecer essa relação, né, em que medida as políticas de ação afirmativa, elas não apenas são políticas voltadas para a educação, mas são políticas de mobilidade social. Né? Na parte da tarde, especificamente, né, nós vamos apresentar resultados de várias pesquisas que temos feito, e isso vai ficar bastante flagrante, né, como a política de ação afirmativa ela tem transformado a universidade e a própria sociedade, né? E principalmente num período de tantos ataques à política de cotas, né? De uma politização de algo que é tão relevante, acho que é fundamental nós nos defendermos com as pesquisas, com dados concretos, né? E que mostram a relevância desse tipo de política. Então, para a gente é quase um ato político a realização desse evento, né? E por isso nós estamos bastante felizes. Bom, eu queria começar também a agradecer aqui a todo mundo que ajudou nesse evento, ao Departamento de Administração, que nos apoiou também aí com o coffee break, né? E com outras questões, sobretudo o uso do nosso corpo técnico, né? O Jansen, que eu já queria antecipar, nós tentamos fazer a tradução simultânea, né? Da fala do Christian, mas em razão de custos, inclusive de viabilidade técnica, porque nós não conseguimos achar aqueles fones, né? Para fazer a fala dele, né? Vai ser encaminhar todos os slides e artigos para vocês familiarizarem com o tema, e a Luísa depois vai fazer a tradução das perguntas e das respostas. Ok? Então, vocês podem ficar bastante à vontade para fazer qualquer questão para ele. Agradecer ao Christian. Thank you very much for your coming. Que se disponibilizou a vir, né? Passou essa semana aí conosco, conversou com os estudantes, docentes, enfim. Isso também faz parte de um processo de internacionalização que, ao alcançarmos o conceito 5, né, se torna muito relevante para a gente, é o nosso próximo passo, né? E agradecer a todos aqueles que são de outros cursos e outros programas de pós-graduação por terem vindo. Ok? Sejam muito bem-vindos, espero que vocês aproveitem o evento. Obrigado.
Com a palavra, o diretor do IPPDS, professor Marcelo José Braga.
Ok, bom dia, né, a todos e todas. Eu gostaria de cumprimentar aí o professor Ademir Baeta e cumprimentar o professor Wesley, né, que estão aqui na mesa, dizendo a satisfação do IPPDS em estar contribuindo com esse evento. A gente sabe que as universidades têm um papel fundamental em promover desenvolvimento, né? E a gente consegue promover desenvolvimento na medida que a universidade se envolve com as questões que são questões importantes da nossa sociedade. E o que estava faltando eram os incentivos corretos, né? Nós tínhamos um sistema de avaliação da pós-graduação que o foco era qualis. Então, todos os programas, os professores, os estudantes, todo mundo queria publicar em qualis A1, A2. Nessa última avaliação da pós-graduação, o qualis valeu 9% do total da nota. Foi dada uma ênfase muito grande a qual o papel do programa no desenvolvimento regional, como ele está inserido com as grandes questões, né, locais, nacionais, associadas aos problemas que a sociedade tem. Então, hoje, né, a pós-graduação tem um incentivo maior para se envolver com esses temas. E o IPPDS, né, ele tenta aqui dentro da universidade ser um centro aglutinador dessas questões. Né? Nós temos uma série de projetos envolvidos com questões extremamente relevantes aí da promoção do desenvolvimento, não só no meio rural, da implementação de políticas públicas. Então, nós convidamos, né, vocês tem um material que vocês receberam, que tem aí a descrição dos grupos de pesquisa. O IPPDS está aberto a vocês, a trabalhos, a projetos, e nós desejamos que o evento seja um evento bastante proveitoso, e parabenizo aí a professora Fernanda pela organização desse evento. Muito obrigado.
Com a palavra, o representante do senhor reitor da Universidade Federal de Viçosa, diretor do CCH, professor Ademir Vieira Baeta.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Nessa manhã, depois de ontem, aquela chuva toda, né? Amanhecemos aí por dia com o sol, né? Um dia bonito. E a oportunidade já pela manhã, né, ter o início aí a primeira edição desse evento, desse seminário, que na verdade vem contemplar muito várias questões, né, a serem discutidas aí no âmbito da universidade. Cumprimentar o professor Wesley e não poderia já de imediato parabenizar pelo conceito 5. A gente sabe e que acompanha a avaliação, né, dos programas de pós-graduação Brasil afora, é um feito. Na verdade, é a primeira vez em mais de 40 anos dentro do CCH que nós temos, né, um programa de administração concomitante ao programa de economia doméstica, que está passando por uma reformulação de reidentificação. Possivelmente, né, teremos aí um mestrado, um doutorado em políticas sociais, dada essa nova identidade. Coincidentemente, nós demos início a esse processo essa semana, onde nós temos essa reidentificação do novo Departamento de Serviço Social em mudança ao Departamento de Economia Doméstica. Nós tivemos a finalização, né, da integralização das últimas de Economia Doméstica agora em agosto. Né, o curso, então, encerrou um ciclo, né, uma mudança de um novo ciclo depois de 70 anos, e nós provavelmente teremos aí um curso que vai ter talvez um caráter quase que, né, interdisciplinar, multidisciplinar, e que vai, de fato, ter uma capilaridade com outras áreas e outros programas de pós-graduação da UFV. Então, parabenizar pelo conceito 5, e, de fato, é isso mesmo, o caminho. Na verdade, esse conceito ele vem num momento não só oportuno, mas certo, e também de um reconhecimento de um trabalho que foi feito, né? A inserção que o programa de pós-graduação em administração já o fez com a interiorização, com a oferta do Inter em Manaus, quer dizer, já começa a trilhar realmente todo aquele par e passo, né, todo um percurso que nós, de fato, temos junto aos programas de pós-graduação de cumprir com esse papel estratégico e também social. E, consequentemente, foi louvável, né, no momento em que o próprio departamento do programa estabeleceu essa parceria com o governo do Estado do Amazonas. Evidente que agora se inicia um novo ciclo, né, para o conceito 6 e 7 das ações de internacionalização. Coincidentemente, dentro de uma visão que nós temos no centro, nós teremos agora, a partir do dia 26 e 27, uma nova missão da UFV à Itália, e nessa missão nós temos aí contemplado a participação da Ana Cláudia, que eu não a conhecia pessoalmente, né? Eu fui conhecê-la pelo nosso Facebook acadêmico, que é o Lattes, e é uma professora que realmente, junto com todo o grupo, né, do próprio programa, até porque o curso, a área e o curso, o departamento de administração é o departamento que passou pela mais alta renovação nos últimos anos, né? Então nós tivemos toda uma mudança com a entrada de novos docentes eles altamente capacitados, qualificados, né, dada a diversidade de formação, de atuação. E eu identifiquei a Ana Cláudia, evidente, de uma forma mais pragmática, o fato dela ter feito parte do sanduíche na Itália, isso favoreceu para que a gente indicasse o nome dela para a composição. Né? Um dos critérios que nós adotamos no centro para a composição dessas missões internacionais, nós tivemos China, Espanha, agora Itália, ano que vem tem Nova Zelândia, Austrália, Rússia e Alemanha, e a nossa ideia é sempre indicar uma pesquisadora, né? Que o centro ele vai contribuir de alguma forma com a presença da questão do gênero, e isso tem sido uma tônica lá fora. Tá? Nós temos pedidos, por exemplo, de professores que estão pleiteando pós-doc na Europa. As universidades têm nos solicitado qual é a política de gênero da UFV. Nós ainda não temos, regimentalmente falando. Na prática, nós temos procurado fazer essa composição dessas missões, o CCH tem contribuído para fazer com que a missão tenha um equilíbrio, né, na presença de pesquisadores e pesquisadoras, e o CCH tem contribuído dessa forma. A nossa ideia é que, no primeiro momento, a gente cumpriria essa rodada dos 7 departamentos que tem dentro da sua estrutura programas de pós. Então, o primeiro foi a História, Letras, agora a Administração, e depois nós vamos seguir aí nessa lógica. Essa primeira edição desse seminário ela é muito importante, porque já começa, né, a contribuir de alguma forma com essas ações de internacionalização que o Wesley colocou. Isso é muito importante. A gente tem... E aí, só que a internacionalização, ela só se efetiva de fato quando você tem continuidade dessas ações. Então, a visita que nós fizemos à China em 2019, né, geraram 2 pós-doc, um projeto compartilhado com a FAPEMIG e publicação de 3 artigos e um seminário ainda no período da pandemia. Porque a internacionalização, você apenas fazer ela em pull-out, né? Receber a Luísa, inclusive, foi um trabalho até de graduação, né? A Luísa trabalhou com a parte de internacionalização no ensino superior, E a internacionalização, ela não vai decorrer só, né, desse momento estanque, às vezes, quando o professor vai, participa, ou não, mas o fruto, os desdobramentos que nós temos a partir dessa interação. Então, isso é muito importante. Então, eu já visualizo aqui essa participação e essa primeira edição de um seminário internacional dentro de uma temática, né, e eu confesso aqui, falei com eles, eu não conhecia, né, do grupo de pesquisa, e que é um tema que tem uma capilaridade, uma possibilidade de interlocução com outros programas da UFV, outros programas Brasil afora. E, novamente, coloca na pauta, né, um tema que tem uma importância estratégica e, consequentemente, social, né, de muita importância. Claro que é um primeiro momento, acho que é importante o evento, né, como foi organizado, gratuito, de fato, acho que carece, né, realmente a presença de outros programas, da gente ter estabelecer essas interlocuções e redes, né, em casa e também com outras instituições. Então, estão no caminho. Para nós, do CCH, é uma satisfação imensa perceber, porque não é a diretoria de centro, não é o professor Vladimir da DRI, não é o professor Demétrios, né, ou o professor Raul, que de fato vai internacionalizar. Na verdade, nós institucionalizamos as práticas e ações de internacionalização. A internacionalização, ela começa a partir do gabinete, da professora, do professor, que faz o contato, que dá continuidade a uma ação, uma interlocução que teve através do doutorado de sanduíche ou do pós-doc. Apenas chancelamos, né, essas práticas. Tá? Então, isso é muito importante. Eu não tenho dúvida que o programa de pós-graduação em administração, né, e aqui eu não estou falando até também como egresso, fiz o mestrado aqui, né, especialização em mestrado, mas por reconhecer de fato, não só em termos de estrutura, de recursos, né, de estrutura, mas do próprio recurso humano que o departamento dispõe e também do próprio perfil dos alunos, né, dos egressos do programa. Então, isso é muito importante. O CCH não vai se furtar. É evidente que a gente procura auxiliar e fomentar na medida do possível dentro da nossa capacidade, principalmente financeira. Parabenizar também o professor Marcelo Braga. Nós tivemos agora uma primeira oportunidade da oferta de mestrado profissional, né, via IPPDS. Isso é muito importante também. Foi algo novo, né? E quando, inclusive, chegou no CEP, gerou uma certa discussão, porque, embora há uma participação interdepartamental envolvendo o Departamento de História e Solos, e foi uma parceria fantástica e que realmente possibilita e dá visibilidade, né, à universidade, aos nossos departamentos do centro e o ganho, né, a sinergia que nós precisamos ter quando estamos numa universidade. A gente não pode fazer pesquisa, trabalhos de maneira isolada. A gente não está numa faculdade, num curso isolado, né, Brasil afora. A gente está dentro de um campus, dentro desse universo todo, onde nós temos outros professores, dos 1.000 e pesquisadores, dos 1.289, né, dos 18.000 estudantes, que problematizam e pesquisam as mesmas temáticas. Então, a gente tem condições de estabelecer isso em rede. Então, essa rede a gente começa com ela em casa, começa com ela com as instituições mais próximas. Minas Gerais é uma unidade da federação privilegiada, né, com o número de instituições da rede, né, federal de ensino superior, são 11, e além mar. Então, a questão das possibilidades, e esperamos agora com o conceito do 5 que o programa de administração realmente vá com tudo, né, e seja de fato contemplado dentro de uma política institucional dessas ações. Eu não tive a oportunidade de conversar com o professor Raul, mas é claro que na hora que eu tive a notícia do conceito 5, tanto economia doméstica e administração, eu já comecei a vislumbrar o print, né? Literalmente falando, embora devo conversar com o professor Raul, eu acho que é possibilidade, né? Vai colocar essas questões dele. Mas, assim, uma boa interlocução que nós temos com o professor Raul. Curiosamente, pessoal, o Centro de Ciência é um centro que foca muito na graduação. A gente não transita tanto pela pós. O Centro de Ciências, ele, dentro da estrutura da universidade, ele é com foco na graduação. Para quem não sabe, os cursos de graduação pertencem ao Centro de Ciência. Os professores vinculados ao departamento. Mas a interlocução dos programas de pós é diretamente com o professor Raul, com a PPG, né, e tem lá seus assentos de conselho técnico de pesquisa e de pós-graduação. Mas é uma pró-reitoria da SET, né, e da pró-reitoria FIM, né, entre ensino, pesquisa e extensão, Claro que o ensino é o carro-chefe, a gente está lá, reúne quase semanalmente, mas a pós-graduação, e aqui a gente tem que fazer, dar esse mérito ao professor Raul, a possibilidade de interlocução que nós tivemos, inclusive nós não teríamos, vamos dizer assim, entre aspas, né, a possibilidade de uma participação oficial, regimentalmente falando, nas missões. Então, foi uma possibilidade que nós conseguimos, em conversa com o professor Raul, porque não faz sentido a universidade estar presente lá fora e não ter a presença da sua integralidade com a área de humanas, sociais aplicadas, de artes, de letras. E isso também acaba, não vou dizer cobrado, né? Mas quando você reúne institucionalmente lá fora, você reúne de maneira, né, global, integral, né, com as outras áreas. É claro que o print hoje contempla basicamente a área de agrárias e biológicas, mas nós queremos, né, enquanto área, uma área já com mais de 4 décadas dentro da universidade, fazer que se cumpra, né, de forma social e estrategicamente, a sua presença nessas missões. Agradecer, então, aí a todos, né, nessa manhã, por participar dessa primeira edição, professora Fernanda, pela organização, pelos todos os estudantes envolvidos na organização do evento. A gente sabe que o evento, quando ele acontece, a gente às vezes não imagina, né, o pré-evento. Novamente, eu vou ter que mencionar a Luísa, porque a Luísa é multifuncional. Para quem não sabe, ela é técnica em eventos pelo Instituto Federal do Estado do Tocantins, e eu tenho que mencionar isso, porque é claro que a gente, no curso de secretariado, acaba sendo agraciado, né? Porque como a gente tem uma disciplina que trabalha especificamente esse campo, ela vem, né, e contribui muito. Então, a realização do evento, a gente sabe que não é fácil, né? Às vezes quem está presente e participa no evento em si não imagina todos esses bastidores. We would like to say some words. Thank you this opportunity, Christian, in our university. Obrigado a todos, um bom dia e um bom evento.
Neste momento, desfazemos a mesa de abertura, agradecendo a presença e participação dos professores Wesley, Odelir e Marcelo, e convidamos a todos para nos reunirmos durante um coffee break, e a seguir, às 10h20, continuaremos nosso evento, que contará com a palestra de abertura, que será ministrada pelo professor Christian Hermanson.
Aqui no hall, tá?
Eu postei um negócio
Passamos por isso? Não, dessa vez não foi bem que vai ser. Ele gosta só da alta sociedade agora. Eu cheguei aqui muito todo você. Ele tem que encaixar na FGV só para fazer uma
Achar de expandir, tá demorando mais que ele viu doutorado, um ano atrás.
Você tá já agora, tá?
Não, pandemia, sabe?
Todo mundo atrasou.
Ô Luiz, você quer receber ele?
Não, prazer.
Ele estuda com nós desde sempre.
4 anos de idade.
No comune, no carro.
Ele era estudioso.
Não,
Eu era estudioso?
Tanto que ele passou de primeira no meu curso de tentar 2 vezes.
Não tomou bomba.
Não tomou bomba.
No terceiro ano.
Mas eu tomei. Eu fui
Não, você foi no terceiro ano.
Ele na área, mas sim, ele tinha.
Ah, sim, agora.
Ai, grande auditório que eu conhecia, não, gente? Que chique. Sentar do seu lado.
Cara, já tem uma pessoa.
Cadê a Keila?
Senta aqui, porque a menina tá aqui. Eu vou botar a bolsa.
Onde que eu sei?
Essa menina já tá aqui, essa bolsa é dela. Eu vou só mudar pra cá. Porque eu e ela só vai poder vir de tarde. Eu tinha um compromisso cedo.
Eu quero ir naquele próximo Os meninos acho que seria bom a gente encher a jarra. Tem bebedor aqui?
Aqui é demais, né? Eu frequentava muito o alojamento. Eu tô um pouco mais inteiro. Eu tô um pouco mais inteiro, então sei que não é.
O sol de Palmas deu o sol de lá que tá É coisa de
Então, é um pouco diferente. Que é o formato web, ou eu peguei esse aqui, ó, e esse aqui eu funcionou, porque eu uso para fazer audições e discussões, e assim, é absolutamente incrível. Foi o cenário do meu primeiro programa. As aulas dos slides, dos professores, via internet. Aí eles anexam no modelo e fazem as anotações direto. Tem como colocar o slide também, aí a gente usa para poder desenhar e poder estudar, né? E depois de maneira de estudar, porque agora todos os meus textos estão aqui mais rápido. Eu vou escrever em cima dele e essa não, tudo bem. Não, ah, então, vamos mais simples. Tem um também, só que as transações ele é bem simples.
Pessoal, de novo a todos e todos. Mais uma vez, obrigado aí pela presença de vocês. Né? Nós teremos agora a fala do professor Christian Hamilton. O professor Christian, ele é professor da School of Education da University of Glasgow. Ele é graduado em administração pela Reykjavik University, mestrado em estudos econômicos internacionais pela Maastricht University, mestrado em gestão e políticas econômicas pela University of Strathclyde. E doutorado em economia pela mesma universidade. Ok? Só lembrando que depois nós teremos a tradução, que vai ser feita pela Luísa, das perguntas e respostas. E aí, para dinamizar um pouco, eu gostaria de pedir a vocês que durante a fala do professor Christian, vocês já fizessem as anotações nos bloquinhos que vocês receberam, ok? Vocês fizessem as anotações das perguntas, e aí a gente já vai, ao longo da palestra, recolhendo as mesmas, porque eu acho que ajuda depois a Luísa aí nesse processo de tradução para a gente aproveitar melhor o tempo, ok?
Thank you so much, Wesley, and thanks for having me here. Such an honor to be here in Minnesota. It's my first time in Brazil, and I've really enjoyed it. It's been wonderful seeing Big Park University live and a good live as well. Yeah, and good morning, and thank you for taking the time to coming out. What I want to talk to, so the format of the talk today is that what I'm presenting here is based on papers which are already in the public domain. So I'll refer to them in the slides. So if you want to have a look at background details and so on, you can consult them there. So I don't think I'm going to talk too much about the details, but more about how we think about things, what are the messages, and so on. And I have an arrangement with Fernanda. I don't speak Portuguese, unfortunately. So I have an arrangement with Fernanda that I will speak in English, and Fernanda will summarize as needed in Portuguese.
Yeah.
Okay. And So what I want to, this morning, I want to make 4 points, and I'm also going to ask a question which I don't have the answer to. So it's something I'm thinking about, and I would very much welcome any thoughts from you here in the audience. But the title of the talk is the economics of higher education as a driver of prosperity. That already signals a little bit where I'm coming from. So the themes are expansion in Europe, impact on young people, and the enduring inequality of access to higher education, which is a big issue around the world. So first of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the sort of academic pioneers, where I'm coming from, and the way I think about the economic impact of higher education. And I'm putting higher in brackets here because the same logic applies to other stages of education as well. And in the interest of time, this is going to be relatively short, and I'm not going to summarize a lot of the evidence. There's a lot of background literature on this, so it's one of those things. We don't have time to debate it this morning, but it's a debate worthwhile having. But as you know, especially in multidisciplinary collaboration, people come from different starting points. They think about things in a different way. They're aware of different types of evidence. So there's ample room for debate there. But in the sort of interest of brevity, I'll just summarize where I'm coming from. So when thinking about the economic impact of education, I'm very much inspired by the work of Walter McMahon, who was and still is in a retired capacity a professor at the University of Illinois. So his kind of lifetime's work has been summarizing and collecting and curating evidence on the economic impact of education and thinking about frameworks for interpreting that. And his background is from development work in the US Deep South, but also in Africa and Asia. And sort of what triggered his work in conceptualizing and classifying the economic impact of education was that he was pitching education investment as proposals, as ways of addressing societal issues, and he would be up against other proposals for infrastructure or industrial development or something like that, and he got very frustrated with coming up against policy officials and donor agencies and so on, and said, yeah, okay, this education, it's very nice, it's lovely, we should all read more, but what does it do for our material living standards? And faced with this challenge, what is education? What has education actually done for us? Well, apart from teaching us to read and write, and I don't know if anybody's a Monty Python fan here. If you know Life of Brian, yeah. Anyway, I'm digressing. So this work has been very ambitious over quite some time, sort of collating evidence of different dimensions of the economic effect of education. So how do we classify impact of education? Well, if we think about this as a kind of 2x2 model. So private market, public market, private non-market, and public non-market. So the two dimensions here are, first of all, we need to distinguish between market effects and non-market effects. And then we need to distinguish between private effects, that are affecting individuals, and more public effects, the diffuse effects. And in practice, there tends to be an emphasis on the private market side of things, i.e., what does it do to somebody's labor market outcomes? What is the relationship between education and labor market outcomes? In terms of what job you have, in terms of your earnings and so on. Lots of debates there, but there's a lot of interest in other domains. And quite a bit of evidence, but not as much. We don't know as much about the other domains as we do about the labor market side of it. And of course, I think it's really important, especially since I work in a school of education where I work with philosophers of education and sociologists and so on, that in my world at least, being interested in economic part of education does not mean that I'm disinterested in the intrinsic joy of education or other ways of thinking about education. But I think whether education is a part of the economy or not, and I think we're much better off understanding how it is a part of the economy. So first of all, just to catch up on the basic is this market, non-market dimensions. I have this, I like to say to my students, the simplest way to think about this is if you bake a bread, and people like to bake breads, there was a big fashion in the UK for making sourdough breads a few years ago, so everybody was baking in their home. And if you just do that, you buy the flour, you let it sit, you let it ferment, you do the kneading, you bake it, and you share it with your family. And it's a very enjoyable loaf of bread. It's good quality time spent. That's a non-market activity. But take exactly the same bread, sell it in the farmer's market, declare the tax. At that point, it's a market activity. So it's visible in the national accounts. There's a financial transaction behind it. So that's the kind of crude way to think about it. But it is important. We value the bread. The bread is equally tasty whether we ate it at home with our family and baked it ourselves, or whether we sold it in the market and it was eaten by somebody else. It's the same bread, but it gets counted differently. Then, of course, there's the private or public dimension, and this is really crucial for education, because, of course, a lot of the benefit, a lot of the effect of education is felt by the people who do the studying, the people who graduate, etc. But that's not all. And we've had some terrible policies where people have tried to think about education only as a private good, because there are substantial public good elements of education. There are spillover effects for other people. We know there's evidence that working with highly skilled people makes ourselves more productive. There are all sorts of feedback effects on civic society and so on. So if we bring this all together, so first of all, what is the type of benefit and who benefits? Is it private or public? We have the private market benefits, which is what people think about most of the time. That's, you have higher wages, you have higher employment prospects, lower unemployment, you have a better choice of employment. The more qualified you are, the more flexibility you have in the labor market in terms of selecting occupations that you're genuinely interested in. Now, if we look at the public side of this market benefits, so okay, the person who went to university got a better job and a higher wage, but what happens to everybody else? We know there's higher productivity through spillovers, and we know also that there are macroeconomic feedback loops on productivity. But then, life isn't just what happens in the national accounts. There's a lot to life outside the market, and there's quite a bit of evidence showing that education has quite profound impact on people's life outside the financial side of things. So lots of literature, for instance, on health, on life expectancy, on people's support, that there's a sort of second order effect on the next generation. We also have a number of sort of non-market public effects, quite a bit of evidence of this as well. So things like crime rates, civic society activities, democratization, and so on. So all in all, quite important. So as I mentioned at the start, all of this is a huge field. You know, each of these quadrants is a huge field in their own right, and we could spend the rest of the day easily debating, you know, the evidence, it's social science, the empirical evidence points in all different directions, and it takes a lot of careful reading and judgment to evaluate what the strength of these positions are. But I think in the interest of time, I just want to put this into the background and focus on the other contributions. There is, I think the balance of evidence is, in my reading at least, shows that education is a social investment with a very high return. And although there's a lot of swings and roundabouts and controversies in interpreting the exact magnitude of it, the weight, the balance of evidence points in that direction. Another point that I think is important to make, that whilst we often focus on higher education, partially for the reason that it's often somewhat convenient to study because it's the last point before people enter into the labor market, so you don't get sort of confounding issues. This is not a higher education or non-higher education issue. It's not about do we have too much or too little higher education. All levels of education support economic benefits from early years through schooling to higher education, vocational training, and so on. So we shouldn't let the sort of intra-education system rivalry. You know, here's the third point, which often really frustrates my colleagues who are working in the front line of education, and especially when you talk to people in government and local government who have to make decisions about how do they divide their budget parts of the education sector. The evidence base that we have is quite aggregate in nature. It's at high level. It's very difficult to trace back and say exactly this program was what generated this benefit. People go through an education system, and there are a lot of influences there, formal, informal. You learn from your fellow students, you learn from your teachers, pinning down exactly what was the good stuff, and tracing that to the impact is a lot more complicated. And I think also, finally, and I think this is a general point, and I like to put this to my students all the time, is that economic arguments get invoked for all manner of reasons. It may be lobby groups, pressure groups, think tanks. What are people trying to achieve by putting forward these arguments? So I think it's really important that we scrutinize these arguments and really ask questions about where the evidence for it comes from. So that's just to give you, I've outed myself as a human capital adherent, not a human capital purist, I should add, but somebody that is of the view that in the main, the notion that education is productive is supported by availability. Now, where does that bring me in terms of the more contributions today? I've got a couple of projects I want to talk you through, or a couple of papers based on European data, and then I'm going to talk a little bit based on work I did with Scottish data. And this is based on, I didn't put the badge in the slide, but I should point out that this is from a research project that was funded by the European Commission through its Horizon 2020 research program. And really the only reason we were able to do this work was that we had a lot of people together from different disciplines over a 3-year time who spent time pulling together the data, getting to know the data. So we were able to have conversations about what is possible to analyze, what is possible to find out, how can we do it. And first talk, it's about how higher education develops at a regional level. So where does higher education take place, and how does that evolve? Does it all happen in Rio and Sao Paulo, or does some of it happen in Viçosa as well? So there are both practical reasons and reasons of academic curiosity why we might want to be interested in how the regional distribution of higher education evolves. First of all, the sort of practical or policy aspect is, as I summarized briefly in the previous slides, but there's also additional insights from economic geography and so on, is that higher education has a very positive economic impact locally, from everything from employing people to these more labor supply, human capital type effects on people's labor market outcomes, to spillovers. And then there's a whole economic geography literature about how it creates knowledge spillovers, and supports innovation, and acts as a kind of focal point for concentrating knowledge-intensive activities. So if you're a mayor of a city, if you're a governor of a state, there's quite a lot of, it's quite attractive to try to bring as much higher education into your region as you can. At the very least, you'll get students who spend money on rent and on the supermarket and in restaurants and bars, and hopefully you'll get something much more. You become a more attractive location for businesses, and we know this from search theory. If you look at Pisarides's Nobel Prize, I think that was 23 or 24, 2003, yeah, before. If there's more high-skilled graduates in the region, it's much easier for a company to set up, and so it can become a virtuous cycle, at least in theory. But so knowing all this, why? So how do higher education institutions behave as institutions, as a going concern? And at the one level, it's quite promising because unlike industry, it doesn't have complex needs for input. If you think of this in terms of in industrial organization terms, if you're running a university, you don't need to have access to a coal mine. You don't need to have access to heavy transit facilities. It's not like making steel or something where there's a certain supply chain that needs to be in place and you want to locate close to those particular amenities. Almost the only input in education is people. It's probably one of the most people-intensive sectors in the economy. Even when you look at health, which we often think of as a kind of a human-driven sector, there's much more use there of equipment. There's much more use there of materials like medicine and so on. Education is almost only people. Apart from the buildings and the desks, that's pretty much what it runs on. So it should be, and from that point of view, it should be simple to locate. You can put it down anywhere you like. But there's a rub here. We also know that a lot of knowledge-intensive sectors, they like certain urban amenities. People like to locate where there's a lot of other people with similar interests. There's a certain buzz. You want to have access to really good international travel networks and so on. So this is a kind of a counter argument. Well, maybe if we put universities in the areas which are not the main metropolitan centers, maybe they won't be successful because they can't attract people. So we can only locate universities where Google and Apple and all the other high-tech employers want to locate. And if that's the case, then that sort of regional economic development argument for higher education becomes quite impractical. Yes, in theory you might get the benefits, but if it doesn't work in the location, well, well, then that doesn't work. So this conundrum is what this paper is trying to inform. So we use data which was a unique data set that was jointly produced by UNESCO and Eurostat. So it's looking at student numbers at regional level in Europe for a 10-year period. And we have something called, I don't know if people may not be familiar with this terminology. So there's something called NUTS region. So NUTS is a term that Eurostat uses for regional level. So it's a hierarchical system. So you have the biggest NUTS level is in the whole country, and then a state and a district and so on. And it comes from French, so it's nomenclature unique territorial statistique. I think you're probably better at pronouncing this than I am. And we have information about student numbers at the level called NUTS 2. And that's a very convenient level to work at. That would refer to typically city regions, that sort of area. So not a single town, but a sort of key city and its surroundings. So possibly, typically sort of maybe 200,000 people, that sort of order of magnitude in each of these areas. And we know, of course, they're not all the same size, they're not all the same population numbers. So what we have is the number of students, and in order to determine how intensive the presence of the student population is, we divide through with the number of the local population that is aged 20 to 24 to scale this number. So, and we get out of this what we refer to as the regional tertiary enrollment ratio. So not that one here. Now, the pros and cons of this, it's an aggregate indicator, so there's quite a lot of information that's been lumped together. So we can think about it as, of course, the regional participation rate, the people who come from within the region to go to university. Also, it reflects the retention of students, to what extent the students who go to university are doing it locally instead of going somewhere else. But then also, thirdly, the attractiveness of the regions for students that are coming from the outside. Now, a limitation of this is that we don't know anything about these students. Are they doing undergraduate or postgraduates? Are they local or are they coming in? That's so we don't have that nuance there, unfortunately. We don't know whether they're going to a technical college or a research-intensive university. But I think it's reasonable to assume at a large spatial scale like the NUTS 2 that it will be a mix of different institutions that this is capturing. And this is how they looked at the beginning of the period that we have data for in 2002. So this is the enrollment ratio by regions, and you can see most of Europe is in that kind of green zone. So each region will typically have about sort of 30%, 40% of the eligible population in age terms will be students. You have a few kind of hotspots where you have a high level of studentification, if you like. So in Scotland, this is closer to 100%, which is not surprising because it has a large kind of externally oriented university sector. You have lots of people come to Scotland to study. Same in parts of northern Italy, hotspots here in the Netherlands. So bits and bobs. I think this is probably bits and bobs in different parts of the continent. And then of course you have a few sort of regions which have a very low concentration of university students. So Eastern Germany here, I think this is Bulgaria probably, or Romania. So Eastern Europe, generally tends to have a lower enrollment ratios at the beginning of the period. Now then, what happens, there's quite a bit of expansion. So you have regions here in Scandinavia, in Spain, parts of Italy which are getting quite high, and there are fewer of the sort of cold spots in Eastern Europe. And also, there's a bit slight data problem here. There was a reclassification in the UK of what counts as students, so we get a bit of a sink there. So here's the changes. As you can see, almost everywhere is the region tertiary enrollment ratio is growing. So in a 10-year period, you're often talking about a 50% increase. And again, as I mentioned, there are some reclassification issues in the UK. It wasn't actually the university sector that shrank, but there was a lot of kind of short-term courses. Commercial colleges were going to an English course in the south of England, and then staying on much longer as you would, and this was politically controversial, unfortunately. Right, whisking through this summary stats. So first of all, just want to show you, we see a pattern. Generally, it's richer regions we have more students, more advanced regions have more universities. And we wanted to ask, what is it that drives this change? What did everybody just grow the same, or what was going on here? So we were using a trick that's used often in kind of intergenerational transmission literature, so what's called a persistence model. So to what extent is the observed state today influenced by what we observed for 10 years ago? Is it the rich stay rich, the poor stay poor, or is there more variability in the system? And what we see here is that the prior position, the level of the tertiary enrollment ratio at the start of the period is by far the most important influence. So it seems to be about half of the effect is driven by where you were at in the previous period. And we see this varies a little bit by the income quartiles. So biggest effects at the edges. So it's the poorest regions that grew most, and the richest regions. So less going on in the middle, but very little. Other covariates are not significant. So your GDP level and so on doesn't seem to play much a role in this specification. Now then, we took a slightly different modeling strategy and wanted to look at the change, what drove the sort of relative change. And we have fixed effects at the country level, because within Europe, each individual country is setting its own higher education policies. So there might be effects from the national policy level. And effectively, that's the effect. That's the sort of shape that we get out of that analysis. So not much happening in the middle. If you were a sort of reasonably successful higher education region in 2002, the likelihood is that you won't have expanded by 2012. So there's that kind of consolidation rhetoric that we hear a lot about, for instance, in the UK, that yes, we're already at 50% participation rate, we should not go any higher, that's enough graduates. But we see a sort of a double effect. So if you already had a very high level of enrollment in 2002, if you were some sort of a higher education hotspot, then it's quite likely that your enrollment rate will have grown by 2012. So you will have positive growth in the period. So these are typically the sort of key metropolitan areas in Europe, the big cities. But there's also something which I think is quite heartening, is that if you were a region with a low level of enrollment at the beginning of the period, you're likely to have seen a stark increase in your level of enrollment. And there are lots of specific examples of individual regions which maybe didn't have a university at the beginning of the period, or maybe a very small sector, which then expanded on that towards the end of the period. And a lot of this is driven by Eastern Europe, but then there are also sort of notable examples, famous examples. One of them is Val d'Aosta in the very north of Italy, which is a valley right at the border in the north, where the slow food movement set up a university, the Slow Food University, which was one of the fastest growing in Europe at the period. So at the time, the European Commission was debating a lot whether research and education should be about equity, there should be access for everybody, or whether there should be excellence. And it turns out that in the end, the sort of policy did both. There was a sort of leveling up. The most lagging regions got investment, but also the most successful institutions and regions seem to have moved ahead of the rest of the pack. Yes, I think I've covered all this, but I think, yes, so the economic characteristics don't have much of an explanatory power, but I think this is one quote, the kind of the conclusion of the paper. And I think for the important thing is for the policymakers, there seems to be evidence that you can have a thriving university sector in most types of regions. We see examples in metropolitan areas, in remote areas, in small regions, large regions, etc. So it seems to suggest that that industrial organization argument that higher education can be quite detached from geography because it doesn't need specific raw materials, it doesn't need specific supply chains, etc., seems to hold. That sort of knowledge sector argument probably plays a role as well, because we saw it's those big metropolitan areas that really grew in their enrollment during the period, but it doesn't seem to be, it seems to help, but you don't necessarily need to be a sort of top metropolitan area to have a successful university sector. Any reflections at this point, or clarifications, or anything that people would like to ask about?
Alguém quer fazer algum comentário do que foi falado até agora? Lívia? Você precisa que alguém traduz? No? Okay. So, at the whole time you were doing your presentation, the only thing I could always think is the Federal University of Brazil. Because I don't know if someone told you, but this university just exists because someday one president, Brazilian president, was born here, and he just said, "Oh, okay, I'll do it there." So thinking about where we are, it's not a great location. It's not like easy for everyone to come here. Of course, there are most people from the state, from the region, but I mean, there are people from the whole country here. So, but in Brazil, I think we're really dependent of public policies in general. So more people can come. It's a federal university. It's free of charge. So these public policies are really important here in our case for people to from all around the country to come here. So I don't know if like in Europe you're rich, kind of rich. I don't know if you have these great dependence, and I realized that I think you were not able to catch these governmental elections in this city. But do you think this is really, really important there here, but or not that much.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. It's in the end, it's public policy, it's decision making that drives all of this. And of course, we don't see it explicitly in the data. You know, we don't have that sort of causal chain of, you know, who made the decision, and also, as it's only a 10-year period, often these things evolve over longer periods. But I think there is that point that history matters a lot for where you got higher education. We can see that in the data, and to what extent that history can be traced back to explicit public policy or something more serendipitous, like you were pointing out. We don't see, but I think what's helpful, which is maybe a slightly simpler argument that we get from the data, is that there's no kind of natural law which says you can't have a university here. So I think there is. I think what our findings are saying is that there's freedom for public policy to innovate and move the education sector to where the needs are.
Yes. My question is about social change and how the university can or maybe help or maybe go in the other direction with high levels of investment in higher education against low levels of investment in basic education. So what your experience says about that, about only investing in universities, maybe can just help rich people to get richer and poor people to get more poor?
Yeah, big topic. I'll just very quickly. I think there are two archetypes of this, where policy has not been ideal. I think one is what we observed in African countries in the 1980s and the 1990s, was that a lot of African countries post-independence invested a lot in their higher education system for reasons of kind of national prestige in some extent, but also because they needed that cadre of administrators and leaders to run the countries. And these were often quite successful institutions, and they were able to bring in investment money and so on. But I think then there was a massive backlash against this policy in the 1980s and 1990s in particular, when there was an end of a resource cycle. So a lot of these countries lost a lot of their economic independence and had to negotiate more with the World Bank and so on. And there was this perception that the university was very elite, and and you had the Millennium Development Goals going. We need to introduce universal primary education and so on. But of course, it is a balance, because you need that class of experts and leaders to, and of course, to run just a classic example. If you want to have primary education, you need trained, qualified primary education teachers. So I think there's a balance there, and in that period, the policy swung too far into saying primary education first, and then we can think about everything else. But of course, the system hangs together. And I think the other canonical example where maybe higher education has been overindulged for certain political reasons is and I'm not an expert in this, but a number of my colleagues do quite a bit of work on this, is this kind of system where you have government-funded higher education, which is quite successful, but then you have meritocratic access, and through faults in the underlying primary and secondary schooling, you have you get sort of reproduction of privileges, social reproduction through the higher education sector. And of course, that's probably the quota law reform in Brazil is the kind of canonical reform of that situation. So yeah, there's a balance to strike here. I think one thing I would like to throw in as well is that higher education is actually, or education in general, it is actually relatively inexpensive. If you look at most government budgets, you're not talking about a huge amount of money, and you're usually taking that money to pay people to do work. So you just in kind of standard Keynesian multiplier, you said you don't have a huge amount of leakage in the economy. You're not importing raw materials, etc. So I think we sometimes overdo this notion that investing in education is very expensive. Of course, it costs a lot of money by any individual standard, but in relation to the macro economy, you get quite a lot for the money you put in.
Christian, it got me thinking about the geographic and financial aspect of that, because when we speaking about university, you can have great university in a macro region, but you have to have good schools in primary, secondary, in all of the regions. This is come to the central question: who will pay for that? And in Brazil, we are a federalist country, so the competence to pay for the higher education is for federal government. So the budget is high. And when it comes to the primary, K to 12 is from the local government. And so this brings a very specific issue about how to put together high education and high base level education.
Yes, you have income variation across the states. So, yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I'm not intimately familiar with the Brazilian case, but I think that's very interesting. I mean, lots of research on this in the US, because there you have a similar situation where the schools are not even at the state level, they're at the local government level. So you have really, even at a district level, you have school districts within the same city which have massively different levels of funding per student. So you end up in these situations where the inequality in the primary and secondary education stages are huge. And different countries have taken different directions in this. You see a lot of, in a lot of low-income countries, both in Africa and Asia, you tend to see some sort of civic initiatives, low-fee paying schools, which are kind of plugging the gaps where government capacity isn't there. Ghana, which is in the lower middle income bracket now, is doing a bit of a gamble where they've said the state is paying for primary and secondary education, and they've had a good few years in terms of economic growth, but are having a bit more of a difficult time just now. So there will be pressures on budget there, but hopefully they can manage to ride it out. But I think there's no, that is a big problem where you have those regional inequalities. And in some countries, the political consensus allows transfers between school districts. In Iceland, where I'm from, we have a transfer system. So the richer districts pay in net, and the poorer districts pay up net. Or it's typically about it's more urban systems which are easier to run, the more expensive, the more rural. But even so, where there's a quite sort of homogeneous population in the social democratic tradition, like you have in Iceland, people still really try to game the system. So the transfer system isn't perfect. It reduces some of the funding inequalities between the local authorities, but it doesn't quite eliminate them. So I think this is one of those sticky issues that, whilst we have technical solutions to these problems, it's the political aspect of it, which I think is difficult. Because it's very difficult to get people to give up their privileged positions within any system. So I think that's where, unfortunately, I don't have solutions on the politics, but there are technical solutions for sure. Great. One more, or then we can move on to the next one. Yeah.
No.
There are a couple of hands up in fact.
Não vou arriscar inglês. Se naquelas regiões que ele mostrou de crescimento, principalmente no leste europeu, quem foi o responsável por o crescimento? Se foi um investimento privado ou majoritariamente governamental? E se ele tem os motivos de por que aquelas áreas especificamente cresceram? Se foi um crescimento planejado do governo, se foi um investimento privado?
So he's asking back in the map that you showed, if the funding was private or public.
It will be a mix. It will be a mix. So, for instance, in the UK, there's a kind of a quasi market for universities, and overseas students are paying fees. In other countries like Germany, for instance, it's strictly state funded, comes out of the state government, nobody pays any fees. So it varies quite a lot from country to country.
And were there like specific policies to this expansion from the government?
No, this is a mix of things in different countries. Yeah, and the expansion will play a little bit more in the next paper.
Can I ask? Okay, so you talked about how a great infrastructure is necessary when you have the university there because of flights and about how people come and go. And probably you must have caught so many buses and airplanes to reach here. So I think you kind of know the situation in which we are because this university was created here and it grew so much. And now we have so many different careers in here. And the question I would like to ask is, can you see the other way around? Because can you see that if this university, the way it is, it's kind of created this university, the way it is, it's kind of created a whole infrastructure nearby, caused because of the whole traffic of people and new incomes and new outputs.
No, that's a really good point and a really interesting one. I don't see it in this data, but I can quite imagine it happening, and I think it would be really interesting to try to do a more formal analysis of that to see what happened. There's a very recent paper that's just out that into circulating in discussions is important now, where we're into circulating in discussions is important now, where somebody looked at the rollout of the name escapes me at the moment, but I can find it for you. The rollout of universities in Vietnam, and was looking at the timing of that, and it seemed that seemed to trigger kind of modernization within those regions. So people moving more out of the agricultural sector into more higher value activities. So that's kind of indicative of what you were suggesting, that there is a kind of a moment of its own that starts forming around this institution. Great. Is a really nice segue into the next paper, which is really starting to look at what you're suggesting is what then happens at the regional level once the university comes in. What does it do? So the question here is really does the scale of the higher education sector in the region affect youth unemployment rates? And this is sort of what it's not clear what's going to happen here, because as we were discussing earlier, there are all these economic development benefits, but we could also imagine a sort of a counter effect taking place, where if you're attracting a lot of inwardly mobile students, they could crowd out indigenous young people in the region. so you can have increased job competition. But of course, this is really important because we know that youth unemployment rates have such strong predictors of economic and social problems further down the line. And the trick is also that young people tend to be much more vulnerable to cyclical downturns in the economy. There's that whole kind of first in, first out when it comes to hiring. So young people tend to be easier to lay off, but also maybe lacking in employability skills and capacity to navigate the labor market, and not have the sort of same networks as others. Also worth pointing out that youth unemployment, as an aggregate phenomenon, it does not play out in a random way at the micro level. Some people are much more likely to be unemployed than others, and typically we're looking at people with low qualifications. We tend to see people from lower social classes and ethnic minorities. So it's disproportionately borne by more disadvantaged groups. So the question is, what really happens when the higher education expands? Now, we're quite aware of all impacts which may then impact on the sort of distributional output. Data from Eurostat and UNESCO. It's worth just going back over the 101 here. So we need to distinguish between somebody who is unemployed and somebody who is inactive, not in the labor force. So somebody might be inactive because they are in education, or they might have caring responsibilities, or so on. So the definition, so the International Labour Organization has certain ways of assessing this, and they ask people in surveys, were you available to do work, were you looking for work, and did you have a job or not? And when we look at the youth unemployment in the European Union at that time, so we're looking at 15 to 24-year-old, and at the time was about 60 million people, the population. More than half of them were economically inactive, probably most of them students, and then you had the employed and the unemployed in the labor force. So about 5.6 million people unemployed. And then there's another indicator which is often used in this context, which is called the need rate, and this reflects trying to get a handle on a better handle on the economic activity, because there might be people who are not in the labor force. They might be inactive, but they might not be inactive for good reasons. They might not be inactive because they're in education or so on. They might just not have any better options to follow. So useful to look at that as well. So what happened between 2002 and 2012? We had the financial crisis in the autumn of 2008, where lots of banks imploded, and the collective response of European government was an epic policy failure, in that they responded by restricting public spending, which of course is a terrible thing to do in an episode like this. Because what happens, your banking sector is severely weakened, so it's much more difficult for individuals and firms to get credit to invest. So you have a contraction on the economy from that point of view. And then what happens is that public sector revenues drop because of lower economic activity. And then the governments do the worst thing they can by trying to reduce in turn public expenditures to offset the reduction in incomes, thereby creating a kind of an economic death spiral. And in some countries, the outcome of this was absolutely horrendous. In particular, in Southern Europe, Greece was famously one of the worst economic crises in peacetime in an advanced economy, and similarly in Spain. So you're looking at large changes in unemployment, youth unemployment at that time, in this sort of doubling ranges, 100%, 150, 200% in some of these regions. And similarly, although not as universally, you've got substantial increases in need rates as well. Not as pronounced as the unemployment rates, but there are changes in need rates as well. And again, we use the tertiary enrollment ratio that I explained earlier to look at this. And as I explained, it's the same graph as before. It's an interesting case to examine because whilst youth unemployment rate was going up, we also had participation in higher education going up at the same time. And of course, there's a kind of endogenous effect there. If work is harder to come by, then in a sense, the opportunity cost of education goes down. So the option of moving into education becomes more attractive. So first of all, we just wanted to look at, in broad brush terms, what was driving the employment rate. What was driving youth unemployment at the time? And this is a very sort of classic model for looking at youth unemployment. You will see this in most setup of this type in pretty much most studies of youth unemployment. So first of all, the employment rate of the older population, the older working age population, the 25 to 64. So that really drives the unemployment rate. So if the employment rate goes down, the unemployment rate. I'm getting my science mixed up here, but anyway, there's if aggregate economic activity is reduced, it'll also have a negative impact on youth unemployment. We also had a look at, there was some small effects from the size of the regions, that they seem to be less sensitive to these shocks, but also a very small effect from the GDP level. Yes, so sorry, if your employment rate goes up, your youth unemployment goes down. It's a bit of a confusing setup. So the primary driver on youth unemployment is the overall economic activity in the region. Now, what happens when we look at the effect of the tertiary sector and its expansion? So that seems to have a moderating effect, whereby an expansion in tertiary education reduces your youth unemployment. And we tried out different specifications. So this is an effect to capture whether it's an average effect or whether it's about having a region with higher than national average of regional enrollment. We need to explain a part of it. But it's quite a bit in the abstract this. So what? So we have expansion of higher education that reduces the impact of economic shocks on youth unemployment. We calculated in the effect size calculation that overall the expansion of higher education in Europe at that time probably reduce the youth unemployment rate by a percentage point. Whilst that may not sound huge, when you add it up to the number of people involved, it was in the order of magnitude of hundreds and thousands of people who managed to invade youth unemployment as a result of this crisis. So again, I think this is something I'm really interested in looking at more in the future, to see how the different angles of this play out. Who are the people who go to university, and who are the people who remain unemployed? But clearly, in the aggregate sense, there's a mitigating effect, a moderating effect there from tertiary education on youth unemployment. Right. Any thoughts on this before? I'm conscious of time. We may. So shall I just wrap up quickly with the Scottish paper, and then we can have conversations at the end? See how much time we have. Yeah. Well, let's do that. Right. So I think we're sort of in agreement that higher education can be used in different geographic contexts. It has a positive impact in many different ways. Which we're still trying to understand better, but it's not, as reflected by our conversations earlier, it's not equally accessed by everyone. And there's been an ongoing debate for a long time about why it is that people don't go to university in the same proportions depending on their background. And there's a school of thought that says this is all down to weaknesses at the primary and secondary schooling level, and only if we could just get people from disadvantaged backgrounds to do better in school, then the whole thing would take care of itself. And there's a point to this, of course. There's an element of truth in this, in the sense that I think the part of what's holding people back is that they maybe have access to weaker schools where there isn't as good a training in how to deal with these standardized tests and so on. So it becomes more difficult to go to university. But another aspect of this is just pure financial limitations. And the observation here was that we were a little bit disappointed that there wasn't more thinking about the financial aspect, because at least the benefit of the financial difficulties of people to go to university is that they can easily be solved through public policy. We know how to solve individual financial challenges. We can have subsidies, we can have transfers, we can have loan programs. So there's a lot that public policy can do in that space, at least technically speaking, but the politics is always more complicated. So I don't know, especially for those of you who are working in a business school environment, essentially what we did, we set out to do a hypothetical investment appraisal for going to university for people from different backgrounds. So we used a survey of incomes and expenditures of students in Scotland. So we know what students from different types of backgrounds, what they spend on, how they spend on, how much work they do, and so on. But we also know a little bit about what they get from student government support. And then we also looked at the labour force survey to look at how much do you earn. Because a big problem is that if you're from a middle class background, say a privileged background, you're much more likely to go into a high paying job on the back of your university degree than if you're from, say, if you're from a less distinguished background, you maybe don't have the networks, you don't have the confidence, so things become a bit difficult. So setting out to do this calculation, and of course, this is partially driven by policy concerns in Scotland that access to universities is not equal, which is particularly embarrassing in a country which has a large and historically old university sector. So it should be able to fix these things at that. And so this is access to universities or participation in universities, depending on whether you're from the most deprived area. So the yellow bars are the share of the population that are from these most deprived areas. The blue bar is the proportion that goes to university, and the gray bar is the proportion that goes to further education colleges. So it's not that people are completely bereft of education, but they're less represented in higher education and more represented in vocational colleges. As we discussed, this is an ongoing debate and has been for some time. Lack of higher educational attainment, the issue about aspirations, but I think also the financial aspect needs to play a big role. And there's some financial support available for students in Scotland. It's not massively generous, but there is some. So the question is, going back to this hypothetical example I was mentioning earlier, if we were only able to improve the schooling for everybody, would that solve the problem? And of course, the truth is we don't really know. We've never succeeded. And the Scottish government has tried very hard to level education, school performance for people from different backgrounds. It's not been massively successful. So it depends on how we think about. We can imagine, say, if we have a causal chain, if attainment in school leads directly to higher education participation, then maybe it is the case that we can just fix the attainment and it leads to HE participation. If we think about a slightly more complicated causal chain, if it is the expectation or plan to participate in higher education that then impacts on the attainment in school, possibly through effort, that then leads to HE participation, we already have a much more complicated scenario. So you can imagine if you're never planning to go to university, that could be for social and cultural reasons. You could think, oh, university is not for my sort of people. We never go to university. So I'm not even thinking about it. I'm not learning about entrance exams. I'm not preparing for entrance exams. I'm just thinking about what's going to be my livelihood when school finishes. So this attainment issue never becomes an issue, really. Similarly, if you think, well, I would like to go to university, but I'm never going to be able to afford it, so why would I waste time thinking about entry exams, preparing for entry exams, and so on? So in those cases, attainment is never the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the sort of ability or plan or expectation or aspiration to go to university. And furthermore, we could add an extra note in here, say, maybe the expectation and plan to participate is informed by what you know about the labor market. And if you know that a university degree isn't enough to get a good job, you also need to sound a certain way, you need to know people in certain sectors, then maybe you think, well, let's not even try this. So I think before we get to, so attainment, there's, attainment is not an exogenous phenomenon. There's something that drives attainment. Of course, quality of schooling, role models, inspiration, and all that plays a role, but there might be other more social and structural factors. So as I mentioned earlier, so we pulled together a lot of survey evidence to just try to do these calculations. If we strip out all the sort of psychological and sociological complications, and if we were just to think about this as a pure money issue, just purely as an investment issue, what would it look like? And we see one thing we see here straight away is that and then the more middle class people are overrepresented in the kind of higher education brackets. And this is probably an accurate expectation, because we see this in the labor force data as well. Similar to the surveys, yeah. So just skipping through it very quickly. So we see here for higher education graduates is that there's about 10% earnings penalty for being from a low socioeconomic background in the UK context. Some variation depending on exactly what sort of qualification you do. I think and of course thinking about higher education as an investment, well, that goes back to Adam Smith and of course guys. But in a sense, human capital theory is just an investment appraisal equation applied to education. So anybody who's done a sort of introduction to corporate finance type finance course will be very, very familiar with these types of calculations. So what goes into the calculation? So it's from the families. We also have information about how much work they do whilst they're students, which partially subsidizes their studying. Some information on grants and bursaries, and also other benefits. So it seems to be that the cost of going to university is on average, at that time, it was about £4,000. So you could have been earning about £8,000. There are various clawbacks along the way. So your net cost on average is about 4,600. If you're working class, slightly more. Even if you get slightly higher, government subsidies, you get lower subsidies from your family. So there's a difference emerging there already. But then on the plus side, what's the benefit of studying? We see a penalty there. But a third factor, of course, as anybody who's done a finance class knows, is it all comes down to your assumptions about the discount factor. What sort of cost of finance are you looking at? And of course, there are government subsidized student loan schemes, so that's a part of it. But we also know that students take out quite a bit of commercial credits from banks, from credit cards, and so on. So we calculate their cost of capital based on this, and we reckon for the average student there was about 7.7%, and probably slightly less, 7.3% for working class students, because they have a slightly better access to student loans. And so we can add this up, and we see that when you add it up, the internal rate of return, the maximum amount of cost of credit that you can carry is quite a bit lower for working class people than it is for middle class people. And this seems to be largely driven by, well, there's a slightly higher cost. There's also a reduced benefit in terms of a weaker labor market outcome when you get out again. But of course, the nice thing about using a sort of simple investment framework is that then you can model policies and what would happen if we increase things quite a bit. So we could increase the bursaries, and that would help a bit. If the wage premium were to be, or the wage cap were to be reduced, that would also improve. But interestingly, also if we could just increase the share of student loans in the overall kind of financing package, that would make that would make the access have a lot more attractive because it would lower the cost of the funding. Right, so really the key message that we wanted to point out here in this calculation is that very straightforward financial factors play a role, play a strong role in the attractiveness or the feasibility of going to university. And I'm looking at an auditorium full of students, and you're probably saying, yes, yeah, that's like, I'm pointing out the bleeding obvious here, aren't I? Because you guys are probably looking at your bank account balance every week. But so why we wanted to go a little back to basics and just do these financial calculations is that we felt that this debate, people were overcomplicating it, and getting all mixed up in structural factors and aspirations and all these things, which all matters. But from a public policy point of view, we can fix the financial things. There are straightforward technical solutions for addressing the financial things. I think addressing the education inequalities and the background inequalities will take a lot more time, but this is a hypothesis of mine, which I haven't yet found the data to test, but Fernanda and myself and others are thinking hard about how to do that. If you suddenly give people the hope of going to university, maybe that changes how they do in primary and secondary schools, irrespective of any reforms at the primary and secondary school level. And I do wonder whether the quota law here was maybe a natural experiment that could be used to test whether there is an effect of this nature. And then finally, the question that I haven't found a solution to, but I wanted to put out to all of you, because I'm convinced through working on research, reading empirical research, and thinking about data for a long time, that the case for investing in education is absolutely overwhelming. But I feel that in popular culture and in politics around the globe, there is sort of like a sense of a bit of a backlash against this notion that education is worthwhile pursuing. And just an example from my neighborhood where I live in Edinburgh, there were proposals to build a complex of student housing. And there's a link here from The Guardian, which is a sort of liberal-leaning newspaper in the UK. And people are very much against, we don't want these students into our neighborhood. There's enough of this university here already. And I was really hurt and taken aback when that came up. But it sort of opened my eyes, and I'm seeing signs of this in so many places, that there's a kind of populist backlash against universities and education and all they stand for. But I'm hoping that it won't materialize, and hopefully we can make a good and persuasive case that education is worth pursuing. I think I'll leave it at that, but and thank you so much for your patience and sitting through such a long talk. But I'm very happy to discuss or reflect or respond to questions or more. I see a hand up.
I have first I have a comment about a public policy we had here in Brazil around 2007, 2008 that unified the selection process to enter in universities. We call it ENEM. I don't know if you know about it, but before that, the student had to travel long distances to try to enter in some college. Even here in Viçosa, we just have like local people trying to get in this university because of distance and costs. And after this policy, any students can try to enter in any university in the country with just one exam. And I think it makes a lot of difference in access. We still have the permanency cost, but helped a lot. it's done in other countries? Do you think it helped?
That would be my key. Yeah. It's not a sort of area of great expertise of mine, but I think it matters a lot how admissions are structured in terms of what students are able to take part of it. Obviously, there are swings and roundabouts. I think what you're saying, I think it's much easier for students to engage with a single system than once you have a system, people will of course try to gain it as best they can. So I'm always a little bit apprehensive about test scores as a metric, because we know, but I think there's quite a bit of evidence on contextual admissions and how they are affected. Oxford and Cambridge in the UK have been using a system where they don't look at people's absolute scores, but they look at people's scores within a group of people from similar schools, say. So if you come from a private school, your entry exam scores mean something quite different than if you come from an inner city state school with large classes, with diverse classes. If you can excel academically in that environment, that sends a different signal than if you're excelling academically in a private school where everybody comes from high expectation backgrounds, etc. And this has been very controversial in the UK. They've been successful in attracting students, very high caliber, academically high caliber students from different backgrounds into Oxford and Cambridge. But there's if you read the more sort of conservative leaning newspapers like the Times or the Telegraph, there's a huge backlash because people feel the more affluent classes feel betrayed, and there's a narrative around, but we've done all the right things, we paid for the right schools, and now you're denying our child the opportunity to go to Cambridge.
Same here.
And it's so interesting because people are saying these things. It's not like these are not rumors, but people are quoted in the newspaper, saying exactly this. So I think if you've always had the best, then if you have to give anything away, it feels like a loss. But yeah, so I think, it's been a successful experiment in contextual admission.
One more. Professor, it seems to me that you have a very applied way of analyzing policies that are prescriptive, how to find the best solution, and how about to inform the policymakers about this kind of result? How is the strategies that you have, your school in Glasgow, do you have there? How the policymakers are open or not to this kind of solutions? And as Wesley said, the end is a political act.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, exactly. I have to be absolutely dead on it. I don't think we're not very good at that transmission into policy. Part of the research process. I think that's something we need to figure out. I think partially we're academia in the UK, and I suspect this goes for many other countries as well. We're a little bit mentally still in a different era. The UK governments used to be very open to academic research, and they used to encourage policy-oriented, evidence-based evaluations and so on, and that this would come through the funding system. And then if you had a piece of research that was of good standard and had relevance to a policy area, there would usually be quite open doors And there still are to an extent. You know, there are good elements that persist in the UK system. For instance, you know, parliamentary committees and parliamentary interest groups, and they search out for people with expertise and bring people in to testify and so on. But it used to be the case that our opinions were explicitly sought. So your government would reach out into the academia and pull people in. And that changed maybe 10, 12 years ago. And we started having government ministers saying, well, we're tired of experts. We care about values and ideology and rhetoric, and we don't want to talk to all these boring experts. And the university hasn't caught up with that yet. If you're in an intellectually hostile environment, how do you fight back? We're used to just having a sort of working with trusted colleagues in government who are like us and think like us and want to get our opinion. But if that door shuts down, how do we become sort of intellectual guerrillas and just push the knowledge out, irrespective of whether people want to hear about it or not? That's something we haven't cracked yet.
Christine, it's almost impossible for us don't listen to you and at the same time don't think in Brazilian reality. We have been researching a little bit about quota law. I would like that you speak a little bit for us about your impressions, how it's the power that these other countries.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I think the quota law is such an impressive example because it's a very, very rare natural experiment, you know, both in terms of just how radical it was. We're doing contextual admissions in universities in Scotland, and the funding council says, you know, you have to have such and such percentage, but we're talking, you know, we're talking less than 10%. You know, the quota law went for 10%. So that was quite radical, but also rolled out through the entire federal university system. So again, another quite radical stand. And in my opinion, you know, experts in this type of research are familiar with the quota law and the literatures on it, but I don't think it has much, there isn't much of awareness beyond that. But I suspect more generally for Brazil, because you know, it's a large country, large population, very important country, and you have quite a lot of diversity in terms of the geographic, the social, the economic, and of course policy experimentation to some extent with different states doing different things. The world could learn from how things are being done in Brazil, potentially underexploited data sources, cases that haven't been studied in depth enough. So I think it would be really useful if it would be possible to facilitate more collaboration between Brazilian researchers and international researchers to bring these cases to bear on global debates.
Alguém mais tem algum comentário, alguma curiosidade?
Não? Sim. Só uma pergunta. Você tem como passar para a gente os papers dele?
Sim.
Falando
Sim,
Sim,
estão disponíveis.
Eu enviei para todos os inscritos. Então me manda um e-mail. Quem quiser os papers e a apresentação, me manda um e-mail. Meu e-mail é wesley@ufv.br. Aqueles que tinham se inscrito no evento, eu já encaminhei.
First of all, in name of the department, thank you very much for coming here. It's an honor for us to have you here. I took notes of much of you speak and you bring for us today. And as you know, higher education impacts prosperity, no doubt about that. Education has done a lot for countries, different ways, but has. But we still have an issue, the issue of access to the university. Trying to bring together your agent with ours, especially in public policy, we read a report from OECD that shows that it would take about 9 generations for poor countries like Brazil, South Africa, to break the cycle of poverty. I mean, to put a child that was born in a low-income family to reach the average salary, the average income. UK, as in the United States, is about 5. Our benchmark, Denmark, 2 generations. And there is a lot of reports around the world, a lot of research finds that put evidence that education is the main tool. Because of that, different policies exist in different contexts. Like Brazil has one of the most well-known experience, the conditional cash transfer called Bolsa Família, that allow low-income children in general to consume education, health, in order to break this cycle of poverty. I mean, what kind of different experience do you have in Europe, especially because some countries still have this issue, 5 generations, 6 generations, and what kind of evidence we have already, or we already have, to put or to translate in public policy to serve as international benchmark?
Yeah, wow, it's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question.
The social mobility question. No, and I think you summarized it very eloquently. I mean, we have the best practice case from Denmark, and it still takes 2 generations there. So I don't think I have a sort of a ready-made solution for any of this, but it is I think we need to think about this in two stages or 2 steps, because like you say, the mediator is so often education, and it's getting people through education, but still that is an intergenerational project, unfortunately. But at the same time, we have income inequality that we can address more directly. So I think we need to work on both fronts, both the long-term structural solutions, but also enabling people dignity of life, even if they're not born into the most affluent circumstances.
Bom, thank you very much, Ken, for coming. We'll be back at 2 p.m. Obrigado por todo mundo ter vindo. 2 horas a gente está de volta, tá? Contamos com todos vocês. Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado. Thank you.
Mas assim, entendi por alto. Alguém vai parar isso aqui também? Não, eu acho que vai colocar
Vai.
Ninguém vai encerrar, será?
Hopefully, they're all quite technically straightforward things. So it's a sort of thing that people do in their masters and they have
Are you okay?
Yeah, very good.
Eu vou ligar para ela no meio do negócio, a Gabriela passou mal, pegou uma virose no coxa dele. Ele trabalha com ligou aqui no meio, quando ela liga, eu já sei. Só liga do nada. Ela escolhe só liga do pai quando é o último. E aí, vamos defender?
Não, só falta que você de você não.
Ah, tô vendo que você tá.
Não, mas ó.
E aí, vamos defender?
Só pra te dar uma
Duas horas para de volta.
Mais a metodologia. Deixa eu te falar por quê. Porque, tipo assim, eu consigo ler a metodologia, mas eu não tenho segurança. Segurança, assim, não é uma coisa que eu trabalho. Isso aqui é como ter alguém que sabe, entendeu? Então é bom, é importante que você tenha, entendeu? Que você desenvolva isso, porque você fez o trabalho. E aí, entender mesmo, fazer algumas perguntas para que eu consiga acompanhar no mesmo passo que você, a parte metodológica. O resto, acho que está tudo bem redondinho, tá? Está defensável. O quê?
Eu rodei tanto os artigos, tem que enfiar uma frase, tese, tal.
Você tem que ter um problema comum, sim, mas não é a tese tal. Você poderia começar assim, qual o problema geral que você está tentando resolver? Entendeu? Qual que é o grande problema? Entendeu?
O problema é formular a frase. Vem tudo aqui, mas na hora de explicar isso.
Eu posso te ajudar, porque a partir do grande problema aí do financiamento...
Você viu o segundo artigo dele? Crise, desemprego e
uma grande frase que vai colocar um grande problema aí e a reflexão que eu trago é essa. Tá? Contribui, portanto, responder isso.
Isso. Pelo menos.
A tese seria a questão transversal para as coisas.
Isso, pelo menos essas perguntas, eu consigo, pelo menos, rascunhar para ser debatido na defesa e falar em beleza. Agora, quantas outras.
E aí, pessoal, obrigado.
Quando foi defender, fala, a minha tese é essa. E colocar uma frase de efeito, uma coisa assim. Eu fico fazendo, mas eu não consigo, sabe? Eu não sei se é obrigatório que tem isso.
Olha, não é obrigatório, mas se não tiver alguém te perguntar, você vai responder. Tudo bem, eu vai perguntar.